A teenage girl left home and did not come back. What followed was not a search that ended quickly or an explanation that arrived with clarity. Instead, there was discovery without understanding, evidence without answers, and a long stretch of uncertainty that settled in almost immediately. The people closest were left trying to make sense of fragments, locations, and actions that no longer fit together. Authorities responded, documented, and preserved what they could, but the truth remained out of reach. For years, the details of that day stood frozen in reports and photographs, waiting for a time when they could finally be understood. If you want careful reporting that stays anchored to verified records and process, consider subscribing so these investigations can continue to be examined responsibly. Esther Gonzalez was a teenager living in Riverside County, California in 1979. She was known within her family and community as young and routine-oriented, moving through familiar spaces without expectation of danger. On the day she left home, there was nothing to suggest that it would end differently from any other. Her plans were ordinary, tied to places she knew and paths she had taken before. No warning was given, no call was made. Nothing marked the hours ahead as unusual. Concern began when Esther failed to return. The absence did not resolve itself with time. Family members grew worried and sought help, and law enforcement was notified. The response followed established procedure, focusing first on where she had last been seen and where she was expected to go. Officers gathered basic information, names, locations, and likely routes, working to establish a clear picture of her movements earlier that day. The search led to a grim discovery. Esther Gonzalez was found deceased in a rural area near Beaumont. The location was not somewhere she was known to frequent, and its distance from her home raised immediate concern. The area was secured, and investigators began documenting the scene. Photographs were taken, measurements were recorded. The surroundings were examined for anything that might explain how she arrived there and who might have been involved. A man came forward stating that he had found her body. His report placed him at the location during a critical window. Investigators noted his account carefully, recording his statements and movements. At the time, this information positioned him as a significant figure in the investigation, not through accusation but through proximity. His cooperation became part of the official record, forming an early reference point for later review. Physical evidence was collected according to the standards of the time. Biological material, clothing, and trace items were preserved and logged. The tools available in 1979 allowed for limited analysis. Some findings could be categorized, others compared in broad terms, but none could provide definitive identification. Investigators relied on what science could offer, understanding that its reach had boundaries. The initial examination did not produce immediate answers. There was no clear witness account that explained what had happened. No direct link could be established between the evidence and a specific individual. Investigators continued their work, interviewing people in the area, checking records, and reviewing known activities around Beaumont. Each step was documented, even when it led nowhere. Attention remained on reconstructing Esther Gonzalez's final movements. Officers worked to determine how she traveled, where she may have stopped, and whether anyone had seen her along the way. These efforts produced fragments rather than conclusions. Times were uncertain, memories varied. Without a cohesive account, the investigation relied heavily on physical material and written reports. The emotional weight of the discovery affected the community immediately. A teenager had been found dead under unexplained circumstances, and fear spread quietly rather than loudly. Families questioned routines. Parents paid closer attention to movement and timing. The absence of clear answers made reassurance difficult. By the end of those first days, the investigation had established facts but not meaning. Esther Gonzalez had been found. Evidence had been secured. Statements had been taken. Yet the central question remained unanswered. Who was responsible and how it happened were still unknown. What existed instead was a careful record of that day, preserved in files that would outlast the people who created them. At the time, no one could know how long it would take for those records to speak clearly. What was known was that the truth had not been lost, only delayed, held in evidence waiting for a future that could finally interpret it. Attention shifted quickly from discovery to procedure as law enforcement began formal work around Esther Gonzalez. Officers secured the area where she was found and documented conditions with photographs, measurements, and written observations. Early reports focused on location, clothing, and visible injuries without drawing conclusions beyond what could be recorded with certainty. Evidence was collected using the standards of the late 1970s, including clothing samples, nearby items, and trace material that could be preserved at that time. Each step reflected the tools and training available then, which limited how deeply physical material could be interpreted. Investigators canvassed nearby neighborhoods and spoke with people who had seen Esther earlier that day. Timelines were built from memory and routine rather than technology. Friends, relatives, and acquaintances provided information about recent movements, daily habits, and social connections. These accounts helped narrow a window of time but did not produce immediate clarity. Several names surfaced through proximity rather than proof, which required careful handling to avoid assumptions. Detectives recorded statements and compared details while attempting to establish consistency across accounts. One early focus involved a man who reported discovering Esther. His actions placed him near the scene at a critical moment which drew attention from investigators. At the time, this was a standard line of inquiry rather than an accusation. He agreed to cooperate and submitted to questioning as well as a polygraph examination, which was commonly relied upon during that era. The results did not indicate deception according to standards used then, and this influenced how attention was distributed moving forward. With limited forensic capability available, the weight placed on such examinations carried more influence than it would later. Physical evidence was reviewed by forensic technicians who worked within the constraints of contemporary science. Biological material could be identified in broad terms, but not linked to specific individuals. Hair, fibers, and other trace elements were cataloged and stored, yet lacked the analytical power that would emerge decades later. This gap shaped investigative direction and narrowed options for follow-up. Without a definitive match or witness placing someone with Esther at the final moment, progress slowed. Community response added pressure to resolve questions quickly. Esther was young and known locally, which brought concern and speculation. Officers balanced public reassurance with investigative caution. Information released to media remained limited and carefully worded to avoid misinterpretation. Rumors circulated independently of official findings, which complicated efforts to maintain focus on verifiable facts. As weeks passed, the investigation encountered familiar obstacles. Leads required verification through travel records, phone logs, and employment schedules, none of which offered clear contradictions. Each avenue closed quietly without dramatic resolution. Detectives documented findings and preserved evidence with the expectation that advances might one day allow further examination. The absence of immediate answers did not signal neglect, but reflected the limits of the period. Internal reviews assessed whether any procedural steps had been missed. Supervisors confirmed that protocols had been followed according to policy. The file grew with reports, diagrams, and statements forming a record that would remain unchanged for years. Responsibility shifted from active pursuit to maintenance as attention moved toward other priorities. Esther Gonzalez remained present in records and memory even as the trail grew colder. This stage of the investigation established a foundation rather than a conclusion. Decisions made during these early efforts shaped how the matter would be understood long afterward. Evidence remained preserved, statements remained archived, and questions remained unanswered. What could not be resolved then was documented carefully, leaving room for future examination when tools and understanding might change. Investigators moved quickly to secure the area where Esther Gonzalez was found and to preserve what could still be recovered. Photographs documented the position of her body in the surrounding ground. Clothing was collected and sealed. Items nearby were cataloged and stored. The goal was simple and urgent: gather anything that could explain how she died and who was responsible. Yet the tools available in 1979 imposed hard limits on what those materials could reveal. Forensic work at the time relied heavily on visual examination and basic laboratory testing. Blood typing could narrow groups, but could not point to a single person. Hair found at scenes could be compared by color and structure, but microscopic similarities could never establish identity with certainty. Fibers were examined for consistency rather than uniqueness. Each result added context, but rarely delivered decisive answers. Biological samples were preserved according to standards of the era. Swabs were taken and stored, though the concept of extracting genetic profiles from degraded material was still years away. Investigators understood the importance of saving evidence, even if immediate testing was limited. That decision would later prove critical, though its value was not yet clear. A polygraph examination became one of the most relied upon tools during this stage. At the time, it was widely viewed as a credible indicator of truthfulness, despite its known limitations. The man who reported finding Esther was examined using this method. Results suggested no deception. That outcome carried weight in shaping investigative direction, even though polygraph results are not proof and cannot stand alone. Medical examination focused on cause of death and physical trauma. Findings were documented carefully, but interpretation was constrained by available technology and medical understanding. Certain injuries could be identified and described, yet the ability to link those injuries to a specific individual remained out of reach. Paper records were created for every step. Handwritten notes, typed reports, and physical photographs formed the backbone of the file. There were no digital databases to cross-reference across jurisdictions. Information sharing depended on phone calls, mailed documents, and personal contacts. That process slowed momentum and limited how broadly investigators could compare patterns. As weeks passed, the evidence began to yield fewer new insights. Each item had been examined using all known methods. Results were inconclusive rather than contradictory. No single piece pointed clearly toward prosecution. Investigators faced the reality that absence of answers did not mean absence of effort, only absence of capability. Preservation became the quiet priority. Evidence was boxed and labeled for long-term storage. Decisions were made to keep materials intact rather than exhaust them through repeated testing. This restraint reflected an understanding that future methods might unlock what current science could not. The limitations of forensic science in 1979 shaped public understanding as well. Without dramatic breakthroughs, attention gradually faded. The investigation remained open, but activity slowed. What remained was a carefully maintained archive of physical proof, waiting for a time when science could speak more clearly. That waiting period would stretch far longer than anyone expected. The evidence did not fail. The science simply had not arrived yet. Attention narrowed toward an individual connected early to the discovery, not through accusation, but through proximity and circumstance. Investigators followed procedure by reviewing how that person entered the picture and what information had been provided. Every statement was compared against physical findings and timelines already established. The process was careful rather than aggressive, shaped by the absence of clear forensic direction. Interviews were conducted in a methodical way. Statements were taken more than once and compared for consistency. Movements before and after the discovery were reviewed using available records and witness accounts. Nothing obvious conflicted with known facts. Small gaps existed, as they often do, yet none rose to a level that could support formal charges. The polygraph examination weighed heavily in this evaluation. At the time, it was treated as a meaningful indicator rather than a supplementary tool. Results suggested truthful responses. Investigators understood that such tests were imperfect, but institutional confidence in the method influenced how findings were interpreted. The outcome reduced urgency around further verdict. Physical evidence did not contradict the account provided. Hair and fiber comparisons could not establish exclusive association. Blood typing lacked precision. No fingerprints or marks connected the individual directly to the events surrounding Esther Gonzalez. Each review returned the same conclusion: insufficient proof. Prosecutorial standards required more than suspicion. Without a clear link supported by admissible evidence, advancing toward charges carried high risk. Investigators faced the reality that moving forward without substance could compromise the integrity of any future proceedings. That restraint reflected legal caution rather than certainty of innocence. The file documents repeated internal reviews. Supervisors assessed whether any overlooked angle remained. Each time, the answer was consistent. No new leads emerged from existing material. The investigative focus gradually shifted away from the individual, not because questions vanished, but because answers could not be produced. Public perception also played a role. With no arrest and no visible progress, attention softened. Media coverage decreased. Tips slowed. The absence of resolution created quiet rather than pressure. Internally, the investigation remained open, but externally it appeared to pause. Evidence tied to the individual was retained rather than discarded. Investigators chose preservation over closure. Items were cataloged and stored alongside the broader collection. That decision reflected uncertainty rather than dismissal. The possibility that science might later clarify unanswered points remained in the background. Time moved forward while the investigation remained anchored in incomplete knowledge. New personnel rotated into departments. Institutional memory became thinner. Reports remained, but personal familiarity with early decisions faded. The reasoning behind setting the individual aside existed on paper, yet the emotional weight of the choice dissipated. This outcome did not mark resolution. It marked limitation. Investigators had reached the edge of what could be responsibly pursued with the tools available. Setting the suspect aside was not a declaration of truth, only an acknowledgement that proof was absent. What remained was an unresolved death and a preserved archive of evidence. The question was no longer who investigators believed might be responsible. The question became whether future methods could revisit what earlier science could not resolve. After early investigative momentum faded, the death of Esther Gonzalez settled into a long stretch of silence. The file remained open, yet activity slowed to administrative upkeep rather than active pursuit. Leads had been exhausted, and no new information arrived to disturb the conclusions already reached. What remained was an unresolved death preserved in paperwork, evidence storage, and memory. Physical items collected in 1979 were logged and stored according to standards of the time. Some materials were sealed and labeled with care. Others kept in general evidence holdings where long-term preservation depended on evolving departmental practices. There was no expectation then that future science would require revisiting those items. Storage was designed for retention, not rediscovery. As years passed, investigators who worked the original inquiry retired or transferred. New personnel inherited the file with limited context beyond written reports. The absence of decisive forensic conclusions made the case difficult to revive. Without a clear suspect or fresh information, reopening active inquiry required justification that could not be supplied. The community remembered Esther Gonzalez, but memory shifted quietly into the background. Occasional mentions appeared in local conversations, often triggered by unrelated crimes or anniversaries. There were no public developments to renew attention. Over time, familiarity softened into distance, and questions became part of local history rather than urgent concern. Institutional priorities also changed. Resources moved toward newer investigations where outcomes seemed more achievable. Cold files accumulated across jurisdictions, each representing unresolved harm but competing for limited attention. Esther Gonzalez remained one among many, preserved rather than pursued. Despite the silence, the investigation was never formally closed. That distinction mattered. The file status allowed for review if circumstances changed. Evidence retention policies ensured materials were not destroyed. Records were kept intact, waiting without expectation. Advances in forensic science during these decades were incremental. Early DNA methods required quantities and quality that older samples often lacked. Many cold files remained beyond reach of emerging techniques. As a result, Esther Gonzalez's death remained untouched by scientific progress for many years. Family members and those who remembered her lived with unanswered questions. There was no official explanation beyond documented findings. The absence of resolution did not offer closure, only endurance. The passage of time did not diminish the significance of the loss, but it altered how it was carried. Within law enforcement, the file occasionally resurfaced during audits or training discussions. Each review reached the same conclusion. Without new tools or information, movement was not possible. The limitations were structural rather than motivational. Decades passed in this state of suspension. Evidence waited in storage, reports waited in archives, names waited without resolution. The case did not move forward, yet it did not disappear. What changed was not the file itself, but the world around it. Science continued to advance quietly. Methods improved without direct connection to this investigation. Eventually, those advancements would intersect with the preserved materials, not because of renewed suspicion, but because preservation made that intersection possible. While the investigation into Esther Gonzalez remained inactive, science continued to move forward in ways that were not yet connected to her death. During the years following 1979, forensic biology changed gradually and then rapidly. Techniques that once required large and pristine samples evolved toward methods capable of working with degraded and limited material. This transformation did not happen overnight. It developed through research, validation, and cautious adoption by law enforcement agencies. Early DNA profiling in the late 1980s focused on blood and semen samples that were fresh and abundant. Many older investigations did not benefit from these tools because evidence had been collected before DNA was understood as an identifying marker. As a result, countless files remained untouched by these advances. Esther Gonzalez's evidence belonged to that category. It existed, but it could not yet speak. Through the 1990s and early 2000s, polymerase chain reaction testing improved sensitivity. Smaller fragments of genetic material became usable. Laboratories refined protocols to avoid contamination and false results. Even so, success depended heavily on how evidence had been stored decades earlier. Exposure to heat, moisture, and handling could destroy genetic markers. For many cold investigations, this remained a barrier. Forensic scientists also learned that hair, skin cells, and trace biological material could hold usable DNA. This marked a critical shift. Evidence once considered weak or inconclusive gained new relevance. Items that had been preserved out of routine caution became potential sources of identification. The value of careful evidence retention became clearer with each scientific breakthrough. Law enforcement agencies began to establish cold case units, often staffed by investigators trained to work alongside forensic specialists. These units focused on reviewing older files through the lens of modern science. Rather than relying on witness recollection, they examined whether preserved materials could now yield results that were previously impossible. Advances in laboratory equipment further reduced error rates. Automated sequencing improved accuracy. Databases expanded, allowing comparisons across jurisdictions. Standards for verification and peer review became stricter. DNA results gained greater credibility within courts, though legal thresholds remained high. The concept of forensic genealogy emerged later. This approach combined traditional DNA profiling with publicly available genetic databases. Instead of matching a suspect directly, analysts could identify familial relationships. This method required careful legal oversight and ethical consideration. It also required high-quality DNA, even in small amounts. For older investigations, this approach represented a turning point. Evidence that could not identify a suspect directly might now narrow possibilities through family connections. The method relied on confirmed science rather than speculation. Each step required documentation and independent confirmation. In Riverside County, officials monitored these developments with interest. The district attorney's office and law enforcement agencies evaluated whether older unsolved deaths could benefit from renewed testing. Decisions were not automatic. Each file required assessment of evidence integrity and legal feasibility. Esther Gonzalez's death returned to attention through this process, not because of new witness information, but because preserved items still existed. Investigators reviewed what had been collected and how it had been stored. Forensic specialists assessed whether modern techniques could extract meaningful data without compromising integrity. The decision to proceed required funding and approval. Advanced testing was costly and time-consuming. Agencies prioritized cases based on evidence viability and investigative value. Esther Gonzalez's file met those criteria. Biological material associated with the original investigation remained intact enough to justify examination. This step did not presume guilt or outcome. It reflected a shift in capability rather than assumption. Investigators understood that testing could confirm nothing as easily as something. The goal was clarity, not validation of earlier beliefs. Laboratories prepared for cautious analysis. Samples were handled under strict protocols. Documentation was thorough. Independent verification was built into the process. These safeguards existed to prevent error and preserve credibility. The renewed scientific review marked a transition from passive preservation to active inquiry. It did not rewrite the past. It provided tools that had not existed when Esther Gonzalez was killed. The difference lay not in investigative intent, but in technological possibility. Science had reached a point where the silent evidence could be asked new questions. Whether answers would follow remained uncertain. What was clear was that the limits that once defined the investigation no longer applied in the same way. The long pause in progress had not erased potential. It had preserved it. Advances in DNA science transformed stored materials from static records into active sources of information. That transformation set the foundation for the steps that followed, driven by method rather than memory, and by verification rather than assumption. When modern DNA testing produced usable genetic material from preserved evidence, investigators faced a new task that differed from traditional comparison methods. There was no direct match in criminal databases. That absence did not indicate failure. It simply defined the next step. Forensic genealogy offered a structured way forward, grounded in verified science and careful procedure rather than assumption. Specialists converted the DNA profile into a format suitable for genealogical comparison. This process followed strict laboratory standards to ensure accuracy. The profile was then compared against publicly available genetic databases that allowed law enforcement access under defined conditions. These databases did not provide names at the start. They produced distant familial connections, measured in shared genetic markers rather than certainty. Analysts began constructing family trees based on these partial links. Each connection represented a possible relative, sometimes several generations removed. Public records, such as birth certificates, census data, marriage licenses, and death records, were used to build verified lineages. Every step required documentation. Unverified assumptions were excluded to prevent misdirection. The process was methodical and slow. Many branches were eliminated through age, location, or lack of opportunity. Others were narrowed through cross-referencing known facts from the original investigation. Analysts compared timelines, residences, employment records, and movement patterns. The goal was not to accuse, but to identify individuals who fit all confirmed parameters. As the genealogical map grew clearer, one family line began aligning with the available evidence. Within that line, attention focused on a man who had been known to investigators decades earlier. His proximity to Esther Gonzalez at the time of her death was documented. His involvement in the original investigation had been limited by the tools available then. To move beyond genealogical inference, investigators required direct confirmation. That meant obtaining a reference DNA sample linked conclusively to the individual. Because the person was no longer alive, lawful methods were used to collect DNA from stored biological material associated with him. This step followed legal authorization and laboratory oversight. The comparison was performed under controlled conditions. Independent analysts reviewed the results. The genetic markers matched with a probability that met scientific standards for identification. This was not a partial alignment or statistical suggestion. It was a confirmed correspondence between the preserved evidence and the individual identified through genealogical work. Investigators documented the findings carefully. The result did not exist in isolation. It was evaluated alongside historical records, original reports, and physical evidence. The alignment between scientific data and investigative facts reinforced confidence in the identification. At no point did the process rely on reinterpretation of witness statements or retrospective narrative framing. The identification emerged from genetic data supported by verifiable records. The method reduced reliance on memory and replaced it with measurable proof. Authorities informed the family of Esther Gonzalez with sensitivity and clarity. The information was presented factually, without speculation or emotional framing. For relatives who had lived for decades without answers, the confirmation provided resolution grounded in evidence rather than theory. Law enforcement agencies reviewed the findings internally before public disclosure. Legal advisors assessed whether any procedural gaps existed. Transparency was prioritized to maintain public trust and institutional accountability. The identification also prompted review of earlier investigative limitations. It highlighted how reliance on tools such as polygraph testing had shaped outcomes without definitive resolution. This recognition was not framed as fault, but as context, reflecting the boundaries of forensic science at the time. Forensic genealogy did not rewrite history. It completed an unfinished process. The method worked because evidence had been preserved and because scientific standards had advanced responsibly. Each step remained anchored to verification rather than assumption. The confirmation closed the question of identity, while opening broader reflection on investigative persistence. It demonstrated how unanswered deaths can remain solvable when evidence is protected and re-examined through improved methods. The identification of the individual connected to Esther Gonzalez's death was not presented as triumph. It was presented as fact. The role of forensic genealogy was neither dramatic nor speculative. It functioned as a disciplined tool, applied carefully, producing clarity where uncertainty had existed. This development marked a turning point in understanding what had happened decades earlier. It did not bring legal proceedings, but it established responsibility through documented science. The outcome reflected patience, restraint, and adherence to evidence over time. The process underscored the value of combining modern techniques with historical records. It showed that even long-dormant investigations can move forward when approached with precision. For Esther Gonzalez, the silence surrounding her death was replaced with verified identification, achieved without shortcuts, narrative inflation, or emotional distortion. Once the DNA identification was confirmed through independent analysis, investigators shifted from scientific work to legal review. The focus was no longer about discovery, but about what actions were possible within the limits of law. Evidence had established responsibility, yet accountability in court required conditions that no longer existed. Records confirmed that the identified individual had died years earlier. That fact immediately defined the legal boundaries. Criminal prosecution was no longer an option. Courts require a living defendant to proceed, and no statute or mechanism allows trial after death. Investigators documented this reality clearly to avoid confusion or misinterpretation. Prosecutors reviewed the findings in full. This included laboratory reports, chain of custody documentation, genealogical methodology, and corroborating historical records. The review was not symbolic. It ensured that the identification met legal evidentiary standards, even without the possibility of trial. The conclusion was formal rather than procedural. Law enforcement agencies prepared an official summary of findings. The document outlined how preserved evidence led to genetic identification, how confirmation was achieved, and why no criminal charges could be filed. Language was deliberate and restrained. The goal was accuracy rather than closure rhetoric. Before public announcement, Esther Gonzalez's family was informed privately. Authorities explained the results in clear terms, avoiding speculation and avoiding emotional framing. The discussion focused on facts, methods, and conclusions. Family members were given time to ask questions and review the process. The official public release followed established protocol. Investigators presented the findings with supporting documentation. They clarified that the matter was resolved in terms of identification, not adjudication. This distinction was emphasized to maintain legal integrity and public understanding. Media coverage reflected the complexity of the outcome. Headlines acknowledged resolution through DNA, while also noting the absence of prosecution. Officials reiterated that the result did not represent a failure of justice, but the reality of time and mortality intersecting with law. The district attorney's office confirmed that the investigation was formally closed. Closure did not imply celebration or finality in emotional terms. It meant that no further investigative action remained available. All known evidence had been examined using current standards. Law enforcement agencies reviewed internal practices following the announcement. This included assessment of evidence preservation policies and cold case review protocols. The review was administrative, not defensive. It aimed to reinforce procedures that allowed eventual identification decades later. The resolution also prompted public discussion about polygraph reliance in earlier investigations. Officials clarified that polygraph results had not been determinative under modern standards. The identification underscored the difference between investigative tools and evidentiary proof. Despite the inability to pursue charges, the legal system recognized the outcome as a factual determination of responsibility. Records were updated accordingly. Esther Gonzalez's death was no longer categorized as unresolved. Community response reflected a mix of relief and restraint. There was acknowledgement that answers had finally emerged, paired with recognition that time had removed the possibility of courtroom accountability. Authorities did not frame the outcome as justice delayed or denied. They framed it as truth established. The resolution reinforced the importance of preserving evidence even when progress appears impossible. Without intact material and documented custody, later identification would not have occurred. This aspect became central in official statements. Legal experts noted that such outcomes are increasingly common as forensic science advances. Identification after death does not weaken findings, it confirms them within the constraints of law. For Esther Gonzalez, the official resolution marked the end of uncertainty. Her name was no longer attached to an unanswered death. The conclusion rested on verified science, documented process, and transparent review. The legal system could not impose punishment, but it fulfilled its obligation to determine responsibility accurately. That distinction shaped how the outcome was presented and understood. The identification of Esther Gonzalez's killer closed an investigative question but opened a broader examination of responsibility, limitation, and institutional learning. The outcome did not arrive through a single decision or moment of insight. It emerged through decades of preserved material, evolving science, and measured restraint in interpretation. One of the clearest lessons came from evidence handling. Items collected in 1979 were preserved despite limited testing options at the time. That choice proved decisive. Without intact biological material and documented custody, later advances would have had nothing to work with. The value of preservation outweighed the frustration of early stagnation. Another lesson involved the limits of investigative tools. Polygraph testing influenced early thinking, but did not produce proof. The later DNA findings demonstrated the difference between indicators and evidence. Modern review emphasized that investigative confidence does not equal factual certainty. Institutional memory also played a role. Records were maintained, reviewed, and transferred across generations of personnel. Continuity allowed later teams to reconstruct earlier actions without relying on assumptions. This continuity prevented reinterpretation from drifting into speculation. The outcome also highlighted how science reshapes accountability. Responsibility can be established without courtroom judgment. While legal punishment was impossible, factual determination still mattered. Naming the individual responsible corrected the historical record and removed ambiguity. Law enforcement agencies acknowledged that earlier limitations were not failures of effort, but of available capability. This distinction mattered. It reframed past work as incomplete rather than incorrect. That framing supported trust rather than eroding it. The case also demonstrated the ethical boundaries of forensic genealogy. Investigators followed legal and procedural safeguards. Genetic comparison relied on consent-based databases and corroboration through direct testing. Transparency was emphasized to avoid misuse of powerful tools. Public communication became another point of focus. Officials avoided language suggesting emotional closure or victory. Instead, they emphasized accuracy, restraint, and clarity. This approach respected both the victim and the audience. The long delay underscored the uneven pace of justice. Time removed options but did not erase responsibility. The lesson was not that justice always arrives fully formed, but that truth can still surface even when outcomes are constrained. For families, the result offered certainty without remedy. That distinction was acknowledged openly. Authorities did not frame identification as resolution of grief. They framed it as the end of uncertainty. The broader investigative community took note. Cold case units reviewed protocols for evidence retention and periodic reassessment. The case reinforced the value of returning to unresolved matters with new tools, rather than closing them permanently. Scientific progress emerged as a central theme. Advances in DNA analysis transformed what was once unusable into definitive evidence. This shift did not invalidate earlier work, it expanded the possible. The case also warned against premature conclusions. Early narrowing of focus can stall progress. Maintaining openness to review proved essential. Accountability extended beyond the individual identified. Institutions examined their own processes. The review was procedural rather than punitive. It focused on improvement rather than blame. Ultimately, the lesson was layered. Evidence matters even when it cannot be used immediately. Patience matters when answers are not available. Restraint matters when tools are imperfect. Transparency matters when outcomes are complex. Esther Gonzalez's name moved from an unresolved record to a documented truth. The journey was long, uneven, and constrained by time. The result was not a verdict, but it was accountability in the form available. The story ended without courtroom resolution, but not without meaning. It demonstrated how systems evolve, how limitations shape outcomes, and how careful preservation can bridge decades. What remained was not celebration, but understanding. Understanding of what could be done, what could not, and what must be carried forward into future investigations.